You're listening to Cooper Talk.
Welcome to Cooper Talk. I'm your host, Steve Cooper, and remember, I'm only as hip as my guest. And I got to tell you something, people. I'm a huge sock guy, and it's funny. I've noticed my whole life I've always appreciated a good pair of socks. But what I've noticed lately is I always get them for presents, or I'll go to the Dollar Tree, and they actually have cool socks. I'll get them, and they just keep accumulating in my drawer and accumulating. So when I sit there and want to find a pair I want, I have to go to the very bottom, and I pass all these other socks that I haven't worn in months. So if you're a fellow sock person, do me a favor, rotate. Anyway, we have a great show today. My guest, it's funny, one Saturday morning I was watching Access, and there was a documentary about Bad Company. And I saw my guest, he was on it, and I said, I bet he'd be a good on Cooper Talk. And I looked him up, and oh my God, what a resume this gentleman has had. He's done like everything in the music world, and he's even a published author. And my guest is Danny Goldberg. How you doing, Danny?
How are you?
Good. Now you look, I've seen pictures of you. You look fashionable. Are you a fan of the sock?
I like comfortable socks. I'm not worried about their fashion value, but I like, I'm in New York City. It's cold today, so I got some thick alpaca socks that my wife got me. Very comfortable.
Great. Now, I have to ask you, you've been involved in the music business for such a long time and done so many aspects of it. When did you first fall in love with music?
I liked music. My parents played a lot of music when I was growing up, classical and folk music mostly. But, sort of the inflection point for me was, when I hit adolescence. I'm a child of the 60s. I was born in 1950, so the quintessential baby boomer. And I would say, the first time I remember I was at sometime between 10th and 11th grade. I was at a party and a guy had an acoustic guitar there. A lot of people were into folk then, and he played "Love Me, I'm a Liberal" by Phil Oakes, and that really blew my mind because it was not just a song. It was about politics and about stuff I was thinking about. And then by the next year, when friends of mine turned me on to marijuana, I was a full-on lover of the music at the time, which was, Beatles, the Stones, and particularly Bob Dylan, and Jefferson Airplane, and Love and Spoonful, and blues artists like Sonny Boy Williamson, and it just became, certainly through high school, like for a lot of people, that's what music meant the most to me. When I discovered it a few years later, there was something called the music business, and that there were jobs that you didn't have to be a musician to get. I was quite pleased, and 50 years later, I'm still trying to hang on.
Well, now you were at a younger age. You were a music journalist. How'd you get involved with that?
Well, I dropped out of college. I was a druggy kid. I got over it, thank God, by the time I was 18. But and I needed a job, and there was there was an ad in the New York Times that said Clerk magazine, and I'd written for the high school newspaper, and the other jobs available were called key punch operator, which was kind of a precursor to computer coding, and I just thought magazine sounded better. It turned out to be Billboard. And it was the job was in the chart department, calling stores about what was selling, because there were no barcodes or anything. Then it was all done manually. And then I discovered there were people on the other end of the office that were not that much older than me that were getting in free to concerts, getting free records, and getting paid to write their opinions about that. And I think that sounds like a good job for me. So I talked my way into getting assignments when nobody else wanted an assignment in the office. They would let me write on a freelance basis, and the minute you have a byline, you exist. So for sort of those years from '68 till around '72, I was able to make my living as sort of sometimes with full-time jobs, sometimes freelance as a so-called rock journalist. I was never great at it. I didn't have the discipline that the really good writers had, but I was good enough at a time when the business was expanding and there was a premium on youth, because the people in their early 20s kind of understood what was going on better than even people 5 years older than them. So in the 90s, I think a lot of people got into the business through hip hop pop, same thing. There was just a cultural divide where older people just didn't get the music. So that was, I did that for a few years, and I really enjoyed it. But at a certain point, I realized it wasn't the career path, and I gravitated into the business side.
Now, in your bio on your webpage, people's webpage is goldve.com. It said you reviewed Woodstock. Were you actually at Woodstock, or
I was, yeah. It was, the dynamic at Billboard, which still exists. In those days, there were 3 weekly trade magazines just about the music business: Billboard, Record World, and Cashbox. And the one that survived is Billboard. The older writers, which in those days old meant somebody like in their 30s, just didn't care about this new kind of rock and roll. They wanted assignments like going to a nightclub where you'd get free drinks and a dinner. So none of these staff writers wanted to go, and the editor said, "Look, do you want to go to this thing?" And I had heard about it, and I was quite, immediately said yes. So I had a hotel room. I went there in a limo with the publicist, Jane Friedman, for the Woodstock Festival, and was there and wrote a very enthusiastic review about it. I was really, really moved by the audience, all the things that you can see in the movie. The movie pretty much reflects the reality as I remember it. But I was pretty excited to be there.
Well, looking back at it, what made it so special to you?
Well, there were 2 dimensions to it. I mean, the magnet was the artist, obviously. There was Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin and the Airplane and the Who and Joan Baez and Richie Havens and, Santana. I'd never heard of Santana before, but when I first got there, they were playing and just really, really blew my mind how good they were. But a lot of the other artists already were the biggest rock acts of the day, except for the Beatles, the Stones, and Dylan. Johnny Winter was great there, and so the music was certainly great, and that was the magnet, and it created the sense of community, which turns out to be so much bigger than anybody thought it was going to be, or certainly than I anticipated. And to see, hundreds of thousands of people that were so into the kind of hippie feeling, guys with long hair, and a lot of people were high. I was not high at Woodstock, but I felt high because there was a sweetness and a sense of camaraderie that was real. It wasn't sustainable as any kind of a political movement or social movement, but it absolutely was a very warm sense of community that people had, and I was really grateful to be a part of it. So I think the combination of the magnitude of it, which demonstrated the size of kind of this counterculture rock audience, and the music itself, and then that particular festival, it did, as the saying goes, have very good vibes. I mean, just a month later, there was one in San Francisco called Altamont that did not have good vibes, where there were bad security, bad drugs, and but Woodstock, was pretty much the way it's been described in my experience. Of course, I'm one of the ones who described it.
Right. So you go from journalism, and then you move into how do you get into the record business? Like, I know you went to Swan.
In between, I was a publicist. When you're a journalist, I mean, again, I had no college education and no skills, except that I knew a lot of people who wrote about rock and roll and had this kind of irrational confidence that I knew what was cool. And the other job that you could get if you could do that was as a publicist, because the record companies all had publicity departments, and then there were these independent PR firms that artists and their managers would hire. So I was at one point, near the end of 1972, I got a job working for a company that was called Salters and Ruskin. They were a big old school show business firm. They had Frank Sinatra and Barbra Streisand and Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus and Broadway shows and stuff. And Lee Salters, who seemed ancient to me at the time, he's probably in his 50s, was one of the grand elders of show business PR, and he wanted a young guy with long hair who knew this rock thing, because that was a new source of business and a growing business, and there was a mutual friend recommended me for it. So I got a job as a publicist there. I had done some freelance PR work and had a brief stint at a record company before that. But the turning point was working for Lee Salters and really kind of learning the craftsmanship of publicity. It wasn't just about asking my friends for favors. It was about writing the right kind of press release, understanding to kind of create what he would call an angle, a journalistic hook to make a client story attractive to editors and TV producers and so on. And so I ended up being a better publicist than I was a journalist. And Led Zeppelin became a client within some months of my being there, and my association with them, was kind of a big game changer in terms of my reputation in the business.
How big was Led Zeppelin at that time?
Oh, they were the biggest band in the world by that time. This was 1973, and the previous album that had come out had been the one without a title that had Stairway to Heaven on it. And then the first one I was involved with was Houses of the Holy, which was their fifth album. So they'd already put out 4 albums, and they'd become big right away on their first album. So they were huge. They had not gotten very good press, though. They were just not a press band. They had become big through radio, FM radio, and there was a sort of a snobbery with kind of the Rolling Stone writers at a time when Rolling Stone really was an important tastemaker in the journalistic world. So and the same syndrome had happened in England, where just the writers were a little bit older than the fan base of Zeppelin, and were kind of snobbish about what these next younger people were into. And Zeppelin, then when they didn't get good reviews, just ignored the press for a few years. So by '73, they wanted to readdress it, and I was lucky enough to be the guy in America that got to tell their story.
Is that a little intimidating to be a publicist telling the story of such a huge band?
Well, their manager, Peter Grant, was over 300 pounds and had been a professional wrestler, a tough, cockney guy, from the poor neighborhoods of London, and who certainly, he was intimidating. He was just not a guy I ever wanted to be mad at me. He turned out to be really incredibly nice to me, and really supported me for many years in the business, and changed my life, because he was the first manager I really got to watch do his thing up close. But it was nerve-wracking. I didn't want to fail. I didn't want to let them down. I didn't want to look like an idiot, and but I knew what to do. I'd been around the journalistic world enough, and then had been around the PR firm enough to understand the way they thought about journalism and angles. I did know, so I kind of knew what to do, but I was in constant terror of disappointing, the band.
So you're a publicist now. Then how did you get involved with Swan Records? I know it was their label, but how did that happen?
Well, I did publicity on the '73 tour in the context of working for the PR firm they hired, and the idea that I had was I couldn't convince the journalists, the critics, that Zeppelin was good, because they had already decided that they weren't quite as good as whoever they liked, but I definitely could convince them that they were big, and because they were so big, they were selling out stadiums, and so that approach of just they're the biggest, worked, and they got the most press they'd ever, and the best press they'd had, and I didn't really know for sure if the band even had read the stuff or cared about it. We would send them Xeroxes of the articles. But then at the end of the year, I got a call from their American lawyer and said that Peter wanted to fly me to England because they wanted to offer me a job. So they had made the deal with Atlantic to create what would become Swan Records. They didn't have the name of it yet. It was just about 6 months later. I think Jimmy Page thought of the name. So it was the sort of unnamed Zeppelin label, and I immediately said yes. I knew it was a big opportunity.
Now, what was your role when you got that job?
Well, my role was, to first of all continue to do publicity for them. or to resume doing publicity for them in the United States. I mean, my role was limited to the United States, but it's a big country and a big market, and it was an important market to them. And then as well as the other artists that they were signing. The first album was Maggie Bell, who's a great Scottish singer. And then Bad Company's first album was the next album, and that was a huge commercial hit. It went to number one. So I oversaw the publicity, which was my strong suit, and then I also was the liaison to Atlantic Records, because Swan wasn't a standalone label. It was really more of an imprint, where the members of Zeppelin had a certain amount of money they could spend to make records and sign the bands, but all of the marketing was done by Atlantic, and the only in-house marketing thing in America was me and a couple of people I had hired. So I was also the liaison to Atlantic for the radio promotion department, the sales department, and to the booking agencies for the newer artists like Bad Company, and later they had this band, The Pretty Things, to try to help set them up on American tours. So those were the areas that I was responsible for.
Now, during that time, what was your focus on your future? Did you'd be in the music business, but what were you foreseeing happening to you?
Oh, I had no idea. I was really just in the moment, trying to do a good job that day, and I wasn't planning a future. I was just trying to stay in the zone.
Now, why did you leave Swan Song?
I had a falling out with Peter Grant in '76. I'd been there about 3 years, and there was an artist at that time I was managing who never became big, a singer-songwriter, but he wanted me to stop managing her if I was going to stay there, and I just felt no one's going to tell me what to do, and we'd had a disagreement about who the agency should be for how bad the next Bad Company tour should be done, because it was things that in retrospect are not important at all, and frankly in retrospect I don't blame Peter at all for creating boundaries on what I was going to do. It was his company, but I was 25, 26 years old. I was still 25, then, and just felt I didn't. I want to do things my own way, and he wanted to do things his way. It was his company, so we later made up, and I had a wonderful talk with him a few weeks before, in the kind of the year before he passed away. But it was just one of those things. So
then, now, what is your direction after you lose after you leave that and you don't have that job?
Well, I knew the one thing I felt, I wanted to be a manager and a publicist, but I didn't have any credibility as a manager, but I had a lot of credibility as a publicist. I've been doing Led Zeppelin's publicity for the last 3 years, who are the best credential you could have. Even today, people are fascinated by Led Zeppelin, but at that time in the 70s, they were literally the biggest rock band in the world, including in America. So I was able to get an initial group of clients very quickly to the PR firm, which I had the imaginative name of Danny Goldberg, Inc., and the first client I think I got was Kiss, who were also very big by then, and who were, I knew their manager Bill O'Coin and Gene and Paul were fascinated by Zeppelin. And then I got Electric Light Orchestra, and their manager Don Arden also had his own label called Jet Records. And then I had a friend named Paul Fishkin, who's still a really good friend of mine, who was president of Bearsville Records, which doesn't exist anymore, but at the time it was created by Bob Dylan and Janis Joplin's former manager Albert Grossman, and their big band, they had Todd Rundgren, all of his first dozen records or so, and they had Foghat, which is kind of a forgotten band now, but they were, platinum band, very big on the radio stations, big concert attraction. The songs of theirs that have survived are Slow Ride and Fool for the City. But so I had Bearsville, I had Jet Records, including ELO, and I had Kiss, and that was a good nucleus to start a PR firm on.
Now, eventually in '80, you were involved with No Nukes. How did that come about?
Well, what happened then was coming out of the PR firm, Paul Fishkin, who I mentioned before, really became my closest friend, and he at a certain point started dating Stevie Nicks, and through a set of circumstances, you kind of 50 years, so you're trying to compress these things, we were able to, a year or so later, we put together a label called Modern Records that released Stevie Nicks' solo albums, but she had an obligation to Fleetwood Mac, so we couldn't really start on the first Stevie Nicks record. They were finishing up the album that was released as Tusk, and so we couldn't really start on the Stevie stuff for like a year. But we had the deal. The Atlantic Records also funded and distributed that company, and so there was sort of time where I wasn't that busy until Stevie was going to start recording. And I had known, when I had the PR firm, one of my clients was a guy named John Hall, who was best known. He was a guitar player and songwriter for a band called Orleans, which had a couple of big hits at the time, Still the One and Dance With Me. And then they broke up. John put out a solo record, which didn't do very well. But he'd asked me to do publicity for the solo record. We knew each other socially. And when that flopped, he said, look, there's no point doing anything more for the record, but I've got this project I want help on. He was a physics major and knew a lot about the environment, and he later became a United States congressman. But at that time, he was in Orleans. You know, he's the guy who had been in Orleans, and there was a nuclear plant being built near where he lived in upstate New York, and he got artists like James Taylor and Carly Simon and Bonnie Raitt and other people to sign on to this petition, create this thing, Artists for Safe Energy, and it was a big issue at the time. And then there was an accident at a nuclear plant called 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania that put it on the front pages. This is like 79, I guess. And, they decided to do these big concerts. Now this had become a big issue, not just a local issue. And they ended up having 5 nights at Madison Square Garden. John recruited Jackson Browne, who was at the peak of his career then, Running on Empty had just come out. And Jackson was also obsessed with the environmental hazards of nuclear power, that the nuclear waste could leak and cause cancer, and the half-life of the radiation was like for hundreds of years, and there were also uranium mining was destabilizing Native American land. So Jackson became this sort of unofficial leader of organizing all that, ended up getting Springsteen to headline the last 2 nights and other things like that. And I just had a feeling that this should be documented as a movie, and eventually I was introduced to Jackson and pitched it to him, and he said he thought it was a good idea, which is kind of remarkable to me since I'd never made a movie before and had no idea how to do it, why I was able to convince him that I was the one to do this. But, I asked him about it 30 years later at a reunion thing of it, and he just said, I don't know, you had this look in your eye like you were going to get it done. So I ended up partnering with a guy named Julian Schlossberg, who came out of the movie business. He'd been a Paramount executive and knew the mechanics of filmmaking and had the same politics, and I knew the music. And together we produced and directed that movie, No Nukes, that was released in June of 1980. And it was the first movie that Springsteen was in. And the last 20 or 25 minutes, he dominates it, and incredible. And Crosby, Stills and Nash had reunited for it, and they were in it. And James and Carly were at the peak of their fame. And Gil Scott-Heron, who I'd gone to high school with, and who'd written this incredible anti-nuclear song called "We Almost Lost Detroit," was in it. And it was really incredible honor to be in. It's the thing that sort of showed me that you could be in the music business and also kind of have a political voice, because of the connectivity between artists and their fans could be important in certain political ideas. The No Nukes movement was certainly successful. I mean, the between litigation and public opinion and the construction of Nuke to Zero within a few years.
Now, so you at this point in your life, you have a great track record. You've worn a lot of hats. Then in '83, you start Goldve Mountain Entertainment. You become president of that. What made you decide to start that company, and what acts did you have? Certain acts that you were thinking of targeting?
No, I was just, the label that Paul and I had created for Stevie, Modern Records, we put out 2 albums of hers. We tried signing other artists, didn't do very well with that. Her 2 albums were incredibly successful. They both were #1 albums. But my role was now Stevie, at the beginning, Stevie didn't have a solo career, and we had to kind of create a solo career for her again, and it was really intensely engaging and exciting. And I introduced her to Jimmy Iovine, who ended up producing the Bella Donna album, her first solo album, which, and all sorts of other things where I was really deeply involved. A few years passed, and now she's managed by Irving Azoff. Her career is fine. It's all in the zone, and I had less, I didn't have much to do. And Paul and I, again, today we're very, very close friends, and at the beginning we were friends, but at that time we were having issues with each other, and I just wanted to leave and do my own thing. So I sold my piece of Modern, and, ended up getting a deal. Jerry Moss was the guy who ran A&M Records, and he liked me, and he gave me kind of this platform for a label that was called Gold Mountain. And the Gold Mountain label didn't do particularly well. I had a couple of records I'm proud of. One of them was by a singer-songwriter named Bruce Cobain, a great Canadian poetic artist. But I had the offices there, and I started management as well. And it wasn't about targeting. You can't target artists, or I can't anyway. Years ago, I mean, this is an indirect answer to your question, but I think it'll explain the mentality or how some of this works for me anyway. I worked with Phil Walden, who years later, he was a great figure in the music business. He's passed away now, but he had been Otis Redding's manager until Otis died, and then he was the manager of the Allman Brothers for the first 10 years of their career, and had them on his label. And then he was saying, people always ask you, how do you find artists? But the truth is, they find you. And that's been my experience also. It's not, you can't just target, I'd love to manage Bob Dylan. I mean, I'm sure there are some people that are so powerful and clever that they can really target somebody. But to me, it's about seeing who's available, and among the universe of people who are available, who do I also like, and it's a mysterious process. I've never really been very good at targeting people, but I've been good at taking advantage of opportunities when they were in front of me or in my peripheral vision. So at the management company, the first artist that did well for us, and I think the first artist we started managing was Belinda Carlisle, the Go-Go's had split up, and she had a solo career, and I knew her lawyer, and I was having lunches with a lawyer saying, hey, I want to manage X, and her lawyer said, would you be interested in Belinda? And I had been a Go-Go's fan, and I needed a client, and I liked her, and I met her, and I thought she was really, star quality. And she was in the middle of recording her first solo record that a guy named Michael Lloyd produced, and it ended up having a big hit called Mad About You. So that was a gold record, and then we were able to make a new record deal for her. So boom, so the management company kind of was real. I had a successful act. And then one person I did go after that happened, was Bonnie Raitt, because I'd gotten to know Bonnie in the context of No Nukes, and I just felt that her career was floundering. Her career was floundering. She was about to be dropped by Warner Brothers, which is the label that had made all her early records, and her live business had gone down, and I just felt, I just had a feeling that she could have more of a career. She was one of the best singers in the world. I mean, no matter what else is going on, being a great singer is such a rare thing. And so I actually did call her and pitched her on the idea of managing her, and she went for it. And around that same time, there was a guy named Ron Stone who I knew, who had worked with Elliot Roberts, Neil Young's manager, and Ron was looking for something to do. And Ron had a real expertise about dealing with concert promoters and booking agents and tour managers, the touring side of the business, where I had really very limited experience. My orientation had been so much about the media. So Ron and I became partners, and together we managed Bonnie's career. And within a couple of years, she won Grammy for Album of the Year, and then I was a successful manager.
Now, you also managed Nirvana. How did that come about?
Well, after Bonnie had that success, I had a pretty good company. We had the Allman Brothers, we had Rickie Lee Jones, and quite a few other artists, Bella Fleck, and but I was aware that there was this new generation of rock and roll that I didn't really understand. By 1990, we're talking about now, I'm 40 years old. I've been around 20 years since 21 years since Woodstock, and had learned a lot about certain aspects of the business, but had certainly lost touch with the pulse of what younger people were into musically. So, and I knew there were these new bands starting to emerge that were really coming out of the punk subculture, but were doing better than punk bands used to do. I mean, the punk bands in the early 80s, would get written about in fanzines or rock critics would like them, but they would sell, 200 tickets. They were very limited in their commercial appeal, and I was trying to make money by this time. I'd had my first kid. But now I was seeing artists coming out of the indie label movement and punk movement, alternative movement like Jane's Addiction and REM, that were doing real business. And so I looked asked around to see if there was a young manager that might want to join a bigger company, and somebody introduced me to John Silva. I don't remember how I met John. He's now one of the most successful managers in the music business. He's got the Foo Fighters and many, many other important artists. But at that time, he had artists that weren't making any money, even though they were very good, and he needed a way to get a salary and a partner that knew kind of the major labels, because So we looked for clients together, and we were able to sign Sonic Youth. They had just signed with Geffen Records, and they had been very influential in the indie subculture. They put out several records on indie labels. They toured all over the world. The press loved them. Other artists loved them, but they hadn't made money, so they decided finally to try it with a major label. But being on a major label, they wanted to have management. And we just met him at the right time. And then Thurston, and I immediately realized that Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon and the other people in Sonic Youth, but I particularly developed an attachment to Kim and Thurston, truly had their fingers on the pulse of what was going on. There were so many artists who were introduced to the subculture by opening the Sonic Youth shows or, being talked about by Sonic Youth. And Thurston told me that, John wanted to sign Nirvana. He'd seen them open to Sonic Youth, and I was always reticent to have new acts, because new acts usually don't pay you anything for a couple of years and maybe never. But Thurston said they had the best band that he'd seen in the previous couple of years, and I completely trusted him. So I agreed that, to meet with them, and if they wanted us, we would work with them. And Chris, Dave, and Kurt came to LA, and I don't know if they met with other managers, but they met with us, and the next day we were their manager. I think they trusted us for the same reason. Sonic Youth said we were okay. And so that's how I got involved with Nirvana. And then, by the next year, because of just a set of circumstances that happened in the dynamics of the band, I ended up getting closer to Kurt than I would have expected, because I was the older guy and all that. But I wrote a book about this called Serving the Servant, Remembering Kurt Cobain, that came out last year. Paperback comes out in April of this year. And I ended up becoming close to him, and in the dynamic around the band, that was kind of my role, was to be the guy that dealt with Kurt.
Now, what was it like as you said, a lot of times you don't like to take on new bands because you're not going to make money right away. Nirvana just blew up. I mean, what's that like to be around that feeling of they were the biggest band. It probably takes you back to when you worked with Led Zeppelin. I mean, it was that kind of level. What is that like when you're the manager?
It was mostly pretty fantastic. I mean, I was really very, very excited to like you said, it happened quite quickly. Smells Like Teen Spirit was a magic song, a magic recording, and it was one of those things, after a week or two of getting radio play, MTV then put it into very heavy rotation, another couple of weeks of that, and it was like a hit extremely quickly, went to number one very quickly, and the same thing happened all over the world. That was just one of those songs that just, totally captured the energy of the moment, that the global pop rock music audience was looking for. You know, it was the apotheosis of the attitudes of punk, pointing out kind of the shallowness and hypocrisy of some of what had gone on in the last 15 years, but created in the context of an extremely memorable melody and great singer, and so it was musically catchy and culturally important at the same time. So the success was incredibly exciting, you know, and it was just everything I dreamed of. I was having my moment, you know, through my narcissistic eyes, of having this incredibly, you know, important band that now I wasn't the publicist. I was, you know, one of the managers, you know, of the band. You know, now obviously anyone who studied Nirvana knows about them, knows, you know, Kurt developed drug problems, and there were a lot of dramas, and he ended up, you know, tragically killing himself. So obviously dealing with the dark side was dark and scary and depressing. But to be involved with such an incredibly talented band at their peak was just one of the greatest things you could hope for at the same time, because if you're in my line of work. So it was bittersweet, because the bitter parts were bitter, but the sweet parts were really sweet.
Now,
and he was also, and the other thing about Nirvana is, you know, and again, I was closer to Kurt than the other two guys, but all three of them were terrific human beings, socially conscious, generous to the people around them and to other artists. So it wasn't only successful, it had kind of a cultural, moral, aesthetic component also. So it was really cool.
Now, as a manager, when the band like that is just blowing up, how do you try to keep an even keel with your other clients? Because they're going to want the attention, but when you have this band that's so huge, it must take a lot of your time.
Well, you know, you have to have enough staff, and people have to know what their job is every day, and to make sure that nobody gets ignored, you know, and I don't feel that was ever a problem for us. I don't remember losing anybody during that period of time. I think that we had a staff of people, and I delegated things. John did a lot of the day-to-day work. I was, I think the trick is to have enough staff. It's really, management is about time. You know, you have to have the right people spending the time, and smart is better than stupid. Experience is better than inexperienced. You know, but at the end of the day, you're in the time business of selling your time, and you've got to have a staff large enough in proportion to the number of artists you represent, so that the time is available to take care of whatever their needs are. To me, that's the biggest thing. And we had a good staff, and we you know, I'd been doing it long enough to know how to manage the staff. So I don't remember that being a problem. You know, I remember there were daily problems. Comes up, somebody's upset, a label is pissing someone off, somebody's sick, you know, I mean, somebody's disappointing in terms of the way the business did. I mean, there's constant drama and stress involved with representing artists, but success is a good thing. Success means that when you call people, they take your call faster, that they're more inclined to do you a favor. You know, that helps the other clients more than it hurts them, as long as you've got the staffing done correctly.
Now, what happened to Goldve Entertainment?
The name actually continues to exist, but I'm not involved with it. What happened is that, you know, after Nirvana became successful, this is by 92, I had my first kid, my daughter Katie, who was then 2 years old, and was really stressed out about the idea of running a small business. I knew it was fragile. It was so dependent on artists who's, you know, wasn't like you don't own any assets. And I was just burned out running a small business, the constant 24/7 demands of paying all the bills. And at the same time, I was at the peak in terms of my reputation in the business because of the 1-2 punch of being involved with Bonnie when she won the Grammy and then Nirvana. So I looked for a record company job, I thought it would be the right time to do that. And again, Doug Morris at Atlantic was looking for somebody to come in and to kind of be head of A&R on the West Coast. And I had a feeling that if I took that job, I'd have a good chance of becoming president of Atlantic, because I knew he wanted to move up in the corporate hierarchy. And that's exactly what happened. So I left Gold Mountain. The terms of my leaving allowed me to continue to render services for Nirvana, particularly relative to Kurt, because of the dynamic I described earlier. And I stayed involved with him and therefore the band until he died, But other than that, I was working for Atlantic, first on the West Coast, and then became president of Atlantic. And that was the beginning of a 6-year period when I was at major labels.
Now, was there an adjustment from going from management to running a label?
Yeah, some were good, some were bad. I mean, the great thing about it was I didn't have to personally pay the bills. I mean, to not have to worry about the payroll and people's health insurance and the rent and just the cash flow. I mean, and to just be able to do, not have all that on me, that pressure. I felt like I got a piece of my life back, which was one of my main, motivations in doing it. And so that part of it was really a great relief to me at that time. A lot of what I was doing was very similar in terms of trying to attract artists, and those I was trying to sign artists to the label. Atlantic kind of at that time needed some of these alternative acts, and we got lucky with a bunch of them. Stone Temple Pilots was one of the first ones. And some others. And what I wasn't at all prepared for and never got very good at was, kind of understanding the corporate politics, and that whatever I thought was cool or important wasn't necessarily going to be important to the company at any given minute. So I suffered somewhat from a lack of sophistication about that, and I think that's why I only lasted 6 years in those companies. But in terms of at that time, I had a network of people and an ability to process what was going on with rock and roll and feel really good about the decisions about who to sign and how to market them. I never really became very knowledgeable about hip-hop, and as the music changed, my value to those kind of companies changed. But so in terms of signing the acts, getting the records made, and figuring out how to market them, that was very similar to what I'd done as a manager, and I felt completely prepared to do a good job doing that. In terms of how to function in a large organization, I never completely mastered it, to be honest with you, but I did the best I could, and there were some good things that came out of it.
Now, you mentioned the book, Serving the Servant, and that's, I think, your 4th book. What made you decide to start writing books? Because you said earlier you were never a great journalist, but you got the job, so you're a good writer.
Well, I think that I always had the bug. I always thought of myself inside my head as a writer, that's something that I could go back to. And as I got older, I found my ability to concentrate got better. And then in the early 2000s, by this time now I'm in my early 50s, and I was things were kind of slow at work. I don't remember why, and I just got a bee in my bonnet to see if I could write the first book. Now, in the intervening previous 10 or 15 years, I had been doing a lot of writing of sort of short pieces about politics as related to entertainment, and I was very anti-censorship and was involved with the American Civil Liberties Union. And when I was living in Los Angeles, the LA Times published a lot of my pieces. So I had come back to writing short pieces and developed some confidence that I had something to say. And then for some reason I just decided that I wanted to do that first book, which was originally published under the name Dispatches from the Culture Wars, and then in an expanded paperback edition, which is the main way it's available now it's called How the Left Lost Teen Spirit. And it was sort of my rant. I'd become really engaged with being a political activist after No Nukes for the next 10 years. That kind of, through that I met people and got involved with, again, with the ACLU, free speech issues. There were issues in Los Angeles having to do with the police, and that was during the time of the Rodney King beating, the emergence of gangster rap, and bands like, NWA, and who were criticized by law enforcement and different things like that. And I became active enough, and I developed some opinions, about the flaws of what I thought the left were. So I wrote that book, and I didn't really know how to write a book, but they got me an editor who helped me organize it. And I had to, like typically with my life, I had this confidence for no particular reason, but just decided that I could do it. And it was a pretty good experience. It got some good press. I did book events around America. And I think it's the weakest of my books, but I'm really glad I documented a lot of what I documented, and it kind of, this was a pre-Obama book. This was sort of anticipating, just sort of an exhortation to Democrats to reach out to younger people more. That I thought that they were too focused on, insufficiently tuned to the culture of young people. I still think that's true. Actually, with all the years that have passed. And then, so that was published, I forget what year that came out, but I'm thinking 2003 was the hardback, 2005 was the paperback. And then again, later in that decade, things got slow again, so I decided, okay, I'll do a memoir about being in the rock business, and that was published in 2009 called Bumping Into Geniuses. And by that time, I thought about I think that book I'm proud of. Again, I like all of them, but the first one is the writing embarrasses me a little bit. It's a little all over the place. It just kind of rambles on a little bit, and then that got a good review in the New York Times, the great validator of a book. And I think it's still available somehow. People tell me they read it every once in a while. And then, another many years passed, and then a few years ago, now that I have this smaller company, I really, I had this idea to do something about the 1960s, because I graduated from high school in 67. I'd been so enthralled by the hippie subculture. I felt that a lot of the books about the hippie culture in the 60s focused excessively on the 68 and 69, the later years of the decade when there was so much violence, the assassinations, and the dark side. And I had this vague memory of this more innocent balance. I mean, there was darkness too. Vietnam was raging, but there was a sense of kind of this unusual balance between Eastern spirituality, as the Beatles kind of started talking about meditation and things like that, and psychedelics, the music, which was just incredible music at that time, and the two big political movements in America at the time, the Black Power movement and the anti-war movement. So, and they all kind of interwoven with each other. So that book came out a couple of years ago in 2017, which was the 50th anniversary of 67 and the Summer of Love and things like that. It's called In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967, and the hippie idea. And then that experience was great. I really wanted to write another book right away. And I realized that this might be the time to write a book about Kurt, with his 25th anniversary of his death coming up. And so that was the next one I wrote. And now I'm at the beginning of trying to do one, returning to the themes of the very first book, but in the context of 2020, instead of the beginning of this decade, about the relationship between art and politics in the Trump era. So I've been writing some short pieces for The Nation magazine about that, and hopefully sometime next year there'll be another book. But I just starting out, meeting with publishers and so on, right as we speak.
Well, what you're writing, you're doing well. What made you get back into management?
Well, I never stopped being in the music business. The writing's always been a secondary thing. My core identity from the time I got that first job at Billboard was being in the music business, and I still am very grateful to be in it and try to stay in it. This company that I have now is called Goldve Entertainment, and I started it about a dozen years ago. I had taken 1 year off from being in the music business. I was the CEO of an ill-fated but very well-intentioned radio network called Air America Radio, which was designed to be kind of a left-wing counterpart to the Rush Limbaughs of the world. And Al Franken had a show on it. He was the star. And then Rachel Maddow, was on there, and that's how she enters the media landscape where she's now so dominant, was through Air America. So that went bankrupt, and I just, what could I do? I lost all my old relationships, in terms of, I had friends, but I didn't have ongoing relationships in the music business, but I'd stayed friends with Steve Earle, who had made records for Artemis Records, which was a label I had in the first part of the 2000s. And he had a show on Air America, and he told me he was looking for a new manager. And I said, well, this thing is going under, and I'm thinking of going back to management. And he called me an hour later, and he said, well, if you're in, I'm in. So that was... that was like 15 years ago, and we've worked together ever since, and having him allowed me to build this little company that I have now, and I'm grateful for it. We have half a dozen artists, all of whom I think are great, and it's a small staff of people, but I'm proud of the job we do for them, and that's, that's sort of a big part of, that's my A job and my day job, and then it does give me the time to do the writing at the same time. So I look at my days are divided up between the two. But the clients come first, and then if the clients are all cool, I'll carve out a few hours to write. And so that's been working pretty well the last few years.
Now, how did you find these clients?
Well, again, they find me. Steve. I had originally met when I was at Mercury. He produced Lucinda Williams' album "Car Wheels on a Gravel Road," which I acquired, and I had heard other versions of it, and I knew what a good job he had done. So I called him to just tell him how much I respected his production. I'd been a fan of his records, and then when I started Artemis Records, he was the first artist I signed, and we became friends. And each artist, it's just somebody. Sometimes a talent agent recommends, sometimes a lawyer, sometimes another artist, sometimes a music publisher, sometimes a friend, and then you have meetings. And sometimes I want somebody and they don't want me. Sometimes somebody wants me and I don't want them. And then once a year or so, we want each other, and those are the clients. Now,
before we go, I know you're involved with Public Citizen. You sit on the board. How did you get involved with them? And tell my listeners what Public Citizen is.
Yes. Public Citizen, I think it's been around for about 50 years, and it's a public interest group nonprofit public interest group that was the outgrowth of Ralph Nader's early work, that was exposing the malfeasance of companies that were doing things that were unsafe. I mean, at first it was the car companies. Nader is known for a lot of different things, but the thing he was first known for was that his investigation of auto safety, as a result of which seatbelts became mandatory in cars. When I was growing up, there were no seatbelts, and the reason there are seatbelts is because of Nader, and I think it's millions of people would have been dead if it were not for that. But over the course of time, he created, so coming out of the fame he had then as a consumer advocate, this NGO was created, a non-government organization, a non-profit called Public Citizen, and they have an array of things. They're very involved in pharmaceuticals, drug safety. They're very involved with trying to get the influence of money out of politics, things like public financing. During the Trump era, I think they had filed like 100 lawsuits against different aspects of the Trump administration, where there's been kinds of corruption. Rather than, if anybody's interested, they have a website, and it's a menu of different things that they do on primarily through lobbying and litigation. They're Washington-based. They're not a grassroots organization all over the country. They're Washington-based. They have a staff, I think, 80 people, and they're one of the leading progressive voices on behalf of kind of consumers and individuals versus big corporations and some of the failures of big government. There's a guy on the board who's been on it for a long time named Jim Hightower, who is from Texas, and I had met him a long time ago. He's written many books himself and is one of the real populist kind of geniuses of the American left, and a hero of mine. And he at one point was asked to be one of the people to recruit new board members, and asked me to join the board, and I would certainly never say no to Jim Hightower about anything, and it turned out I now share his enthusiasm for the organization. I mean, being on a board is not that big a deal compared to being on the staff, the people who do the work of the staff. But, you know, they're in board meetings several times a year, and you're responsible in theory for the funding. I mean, it's a pretty well, you know, this is a good grassroots, and a lot of people give donations to them, and they have a pretty sophisticated fundraising operation, but you're still, that's part of the job, and to occasionally deal with the policy issues or staff issues that come up. But, you know, I'm honored to be on the board, but it's the people who run it. The guy named Rob Wiseman is the executive director of it that deserve the credit for their work. And, you know, along with the ACLU and Planned Parenthood and the national, you know, some of the environmental groups, I mean, they're one of the great progressive institutions in the country.
Yeah, they are great. You know, it's funny. We had mentioned Steve Scrovan earlier. He had come on my show when I was in L.A. I went to 2 of the comedy shows that were fundraisers, and they were just so great, and the talent that came out and did them, and it was just so fun. Yeah,
I met Steve Scrovan through being on the board of Public Citizen. I didn't know him before, and he's a special guy. He's a film director. He did the documentary about Ralph Nader. I think it's called The Difficult Man or something like that, but it's the documentary about him. And he's, you know, kind of a comic himself, but extremely well connected with a lot of Los Angeles area comics. And for many years, I think every year since I've been around, and for several years before that, so it's probably coming up on a decade, he does these annual fundraising comedy events as fundraisers for Public Citizen. And, yeah, it's really cool. He gets like 8-10 of the, you know, top people, and it's funny and it's political, and, you know, in this Trump era in particular, I think comedy has become just such an important component of the culture. It's like, you know, when I was growing up, we used to talk about, you know, well, music is the soundtrack of our times. You know, the R&B connected to the civil rights movement, some of the rock and roll connected to the anti-war movement. To me, the soundtrack of the Trump era is comedy. I mean, the amount of political comedy is just mind-blowing. You know, it seems like every late night comic gets into politics, and you go on Netflix and special after special after special, you know, whether it's Chelsea Handler or Kathy Griffin or, you know, it's just incredible. You know, Chris Rock, George Lopez. So comedy really is playing an important role now, I think, in kind of how America is defining itself as sort of part of the mix. There's so many different things happening all at the same time, but it's an amazing age for political comedy. I can't remember anything ever like it.
Well, you know, I want to thank you for coming on. It's so funny, when I saw you in the documentary, I said, this guy knows the biz. And now Serving the Servant will come out in paperback when?
April. I forget the exact date, but soon, you know, sometime first couple of weeks of April.
All right, well, great. I want to thank you. How can people look you up? I know it's the website for the management company is goldve.com.
Yeah, goldve.com is the best place. If anyone, you know, there's an address there where if people want to send an email to me through the company website, they, you know, I think it's info@goldve.com, and it's got a bio of me and a list of our clients. So that's probably the best place to start.
Okay, so people, check out Danny. Go to my website, coopertalk.net. You can find over 775 episodes. Email me, cooper@coopertalk.net. And follow me on Twitter. I'm at Cooper Talk. So remember, I'm Steve Cooper. I'm only as hip as my guest. Don't forget, drink your water, eat your vegetables, take your vitamins, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Thank you.